Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Joe Weiler. I'm a professor emeritus from the Allard School of Law, at UBC, and I'm have been the co-director of the anti-corruption law program for the last few years with my friend and colleague John Ritchie. So welcome to the first anti-corruption law program webinar, a monthly webinar for 2021. It's so gratifying to have so many people registered today. Our program has provided in-person seminars where you came to us, but now we're so much stronger because we're going to be able to come to you, whether it's in your home office or your professional office. So we didn't have any sessions in 2020 because of the pandemic, but now what we're able to do is as the three founding working partners in the program are now able to combine our resources again and our core competencies and to put on sort of top level professional, education experiences around fighting corruption. So I just wanted to acknowledge a couple of people who have been particularly helpful. Paul Lalonde has registered today. He's senior counsel at Denton's. He was for years the chair of Transparency International Canada. But Paul routinely, while he was chair, came out to Vancouver and chaired sessions. Denton's hosted a lot of our sessions. But Paul actually is one of the people that inspired this new webinar series that we're putting on now. He was, in early May, Paul chaired a session that TI organized, and it had to do with procurement in the era of COVID. And he worked closely with James Cohen, who's the brilliant, hardworking executive director of TI Canada, and they organized that seminar. And then through the next 6 months, there was 10 actually webinars that TI Canada put on, and they really provided the model of effective ongoing professional education experiences that could, that has really inspired what we're doing this year in the anti-corruption law program. Dr. Carol Liao, and who's the director for the Center for Business Law at Allard, and my colleague there, and her new assistant director, Charles Lee. They've added a huge technical and professional backup to the anti-corruption law program. So we're able to up our game and provide a much better face and much more effective experiences for all of you. And Susan Cote Freeman. Susan is the current chair of TI Canada, and she has supported and really been an advocate for this kind of webinar, education that TI Canada has been put on, and actually was helpful in even organizing our panel today and recruiting one of our panelists. So it takes a village, right? It takes a lot of people to put on these sessions, and we now have a new working group within the anti-corruption law program. Obviously, my colleague John Ritchie is there, but Paul Townsend, Norm Baldwin, who are on the panel today, Dr. Daniela Chamiso dos Santos, and Joe Ringwald, they're going to be organizing sessions in the spring and summer. Dr. Peter German, who's president of iClear, and Joanne Macron, who's the new executive director of iClear. They're taking the lead in organizing anti-corruption law program seminars and webinars in the late summer, fall. So, and all other speakers and panelists, right? It takes all of you to make these sessions possible. So, as well as the participants, these are very interactive experiences, and all of us are simply trying to teach each other, about the best ways to fight corruption. So it's my pleasure now to introduce Norm Baldwin, who's chairing or moderating our experience today. Norm's been a very active participant in our sessions for the last few years. and probing questions and insightful comments. And, he says that, he thought he'd learned everything in his experience working for 12 years in Brazil as an anti-corruption consultant. And prior to that, working for Vancouver-based companies, particularly mining companies, and helping them through their subsidiaries, raise their compliance standards, manage, their risk assessments, and all of which is along the lines of what we're talking about today. So Norm thought he knew everything, and he says, until he started coming to our sessions, and now he realizes that there's other things that he can learn around anti-corruption and the best way to deal with it. So I just turning it over to Norm now to chair the session today, and thanking everybody who's involved in organizing and attending these sessions. Thank you. Over to you, Norm.
Well, thank you, Joe, for that introduction. I'd like to also thank all the participants today. We have rather a large number of you, approximately 100 people who are participating today, and you're located all around the world. I know there are some people from Brazil, there are people across Canada and the United States, and even over into Asia and Europe and Africa. So welcome one and all. And again, just echoing Joe, I'd like to thank Charles Lee and his technical team for directing all the technical aspects of today's event. It is not just a case of simply pushing a button. There are a lot of moving parts that all have to be operating in synchrony. So thank you, Charles. Today's seminar is on anti-corruption and integrity for small and medium-sized enterprises. It is the first of 12 seminars that the Anti-Corruption Law Program will be presenting this year. So we'll have approximately one per month, and I can give you some more information on some upcoming events later on in today's event. I will also have more information about how to see a recording of today's event. It'll be posted on various websites and pages that are related to the Anti-Corruption Law Program. As Joe mentioned, we are connected with the University of British Columbia. So at this point, I would like to acknowledge with deep gratitude that its campuses in Vancouver are situated on the traditional unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, while its Kelowna campus is in the territory of the Syilx Okanagan Nation. So in today's presentations, you are probably going to hear the word corruption quite a bit. Not surprising, because that is what the Anti-Corruption Law Program focuses on. The term corruption, as I'm sure a lot of you are familiar, is often grouped with financial crime, but corruption is easily able to stand on its own. So let's look at what corruption is exactly. Now, there's two definitions that I like to use. One comes from one of our sponsors today, which is Transparency International, and they define corruption as the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, the abuse of entrusted power for private gain. And that's certainly a nice, simple definition that all of us, I think, can grasp. An old professor of mine had a slightly expanded version of that definition, which is corruption is the abuse or misuse of power or trust for personal benefit, rather than the reasons for which that power or trust was given. And that sort of widens the tent or the umbrella a little bit of how we can define corruption. And we're all familiar with the examples of corruption: bribery, extortion, nepotism, influence peddling. We see these things in the press all the time, unfortunately. And these corrupt activities lead to larger changes in society and in our markets, usually through the form of widespread distortions and misallocations. And these distortions and misallocations in turn lead to a lack of trust in our institutions and in companies. It leads to confusion in society and in the markets. It can lead to the creation of monopolies, which is not always a healthy thing. It can lead to a lack of competition, a reduced flow of goods, and of course, in a lot of countries around the world, a lower tax base. Simply people just aren't paying their taxes. It can lead to the rise of parallel institutions because people aren't satisfied with their governments or with the companies that are supposedly providing them with products or services. And something I became very familiar with in Brazil, these distortions and misallocations due to corruption can lead to the rise of black markets and underground economies. So corruption is around us everywhere, whether we like it or not. And the United Nations has some words to say about corruption. They have a convention against corruption. And in the preamble, they talk about corruption as an insidious plague that has a wide range of corrosive effects on societies. It undermines democracy and the rule of law. It leads to violations of human rights. It distorts markets, erodes the quality of life, and allows organized crime, terrorism, and other threats to human society to flourish. So I think that's a pretty good look at the scope and scale of how corruption affects all of us. Now, one of the organizations responsible for putting on today's event, as I mentioned, is Transparency International Canada. And the parent group of that, Transparency International, just released yesterday its 2020 Corruption Perceptions Index, which is a ranking of the level of corruption as it is perceived in countries all around the world. And they measured this in 180 countries. And the ranking works on the basis of a low score means that you're terribly corrupt, and a very high score means you're not very corrupt at all in terms of a country. So the winner this year was New Zealand, came out with a score of 88, which was good for them. But for the rest of us, only 59 countries out of those 180 scored 50 or better. So that's only 32% of all countries in the world had a ranking of 50 or better on the Transparency International scale. So what does that mean in real terms? Well, that 2/3 of the world's countries continue to be corrupt or endemically corrupt. And even here in Canada, we like to think that we're not a particularly corrupt country, and we're not, in fact. We didn't make the top 10 this year. And unfortunately, just the other day, there was a fairly nasty article in the paper of a, pardon me, a mid-level bureaucrat in Ontario who was involved in quite a nasty bit of corruption involving COVID-19 money. I'm sure some of you have seen that in the press. So corruption can affect anyone, anywhere. And there is a cost to corruption. It is rather hard to calculate, but it has been estimated that it costs each year about, well, somewhere in the neighborhood of several $1 trillion worldwide. So it is an expensive problem. Now, our speakers today are not only going to talk about corruption, they're also going to talk about small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs. Now, the definition of an SME varies depending on where you are. In the European Union, it's anywhere up to a company anywhere up to 250 employees. In Canada, perhaps Yulia later on can sort of clarify this for us, but I think generally we talk about companies with employees of up to 500. And in the USA, it can actually go all the way up to 1,500 depending on the sector. But whatever definition of SME you want to use, the most important thing to remember that almost all companies everywhere are SMEs. In Canada, about 99% of every business in this country is an SME. And that same number is the same in the United Kingdom, Australia, Brazil, even in the United States. In fact, it's even higher in the United States. About 99.9%, or about over 30 million companies in the United States are considered as SMEs. So now that we know what corruption is and what an SME is, what happens when we put the two together? Well, luckily for us today, we have 4 expert panelists to show us how these two elements intersect, the problems that can arise, and the strategies to overcome them. So I'd now like to introduce, pardon me, our first speaker, Paul Townsend. He's based in Vancouver, and he's a chartered accountant and a certified internal auditor, and has over 30 years of experience in risk management, audit, and compliance. For 16 years, Paul was with the TK Group. I'm sure you've heard of that. It is one of the world's largest marine energy transportation companies. And at TK, Paul was the Chief Risk Officer, VP of Audit, and Chief Compliance Officer. And that allowed him to lead a global team responsible for enterprise risk management, audit, and global anti-corruption efforts, including training and investigations. So he knows his corruption backwards and forwards. He was the vice chair of the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network, which is a wonderful organization, and hopefully Paul will give us a few words about that. He was also past president of the Vancouver chapter of the Institute of Internal Auditors. He is now in private practice, where he advises organizations on enhancing their compliance programs to ensure that they effectively manage the risks related to corruption. And today, Paul is going to speak on effective ABC compliance for small and medium-sized enterprises. So Paul, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Norman. You know, I've heard many times, well, we just don't have the resources for a compliance program, and we don't have a compliance department, so there's no way that we could have a robust program. And you know, I'm here to tell you that it's not primarily about having a robust program. It's having one that mitigates your particular risks. You know, we know that large multinational corporations have more risks. So just because you aren't a large listed company with operations around the world isn't an excuse to not having an effective program against your risks. And I've assisted several medium-sized organizations with no dedicated compliance staff, very little resources allocated to compliance, just a named compliance officer. And we've developed an effective compliance program for their risks. So but you do need some guidance. The best guidance that I've seen that's out there is the hallmarks of an effective compliance program. You can find it online. It's put out jointly by the Department of Justice and the Securities Exchange Commission. It's essentially for compliance with the FCPA, but the FCPA, really, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, is the most recognized standard. And of course, you've all heard in the news about the actions from DOJ. You know, they're going after companies, you know, all over the world. So this is the standard. And when, you know, you get authorities coming in and you say, hey, listen, we've used the guidance from DOJ, SEC, you're in great shape. So my points are based on those hallmarks and my experience in working with medium-sized organizations. And the DOJ does take into account the size of the organization. You know, the expectations are different and the risks are far less. So I'm going to give you practical help. I'm going to give you the skinny on what do you absolutely need to do and what can maybe wait until later, and what maybe you don't have to do at all if you're a medium-sized organization. And for ease of presentation and for you to be able to remember them, I've broken them up into, okay, here's the 5 steps, you know, that you absolutely need to take. And then I've given you another 5 steps, you know, the next steps. If you get those done, and you know, you definitely need a plan to get to the next steps, but you got to start with the first ones. So let's jump into that. So the first thing that you've got to do is you've got to have strong CEO support. You know, this is especially true in smaller organizations where everybody looks to the CEO. If the CEO isn't on board, you can't cascade it down. It's like, you know, pushing a piece of string uphill. If you haven't got it, get it. You got to convince your CEO how critical this is to your business. And you even if you get him to talk about it, you can't just have a CEO that's talking the talk. He's got to walk the talk. We all saw in the news about this CEO that went up to the Yukon to get his vaccines done. They had core values. That CEO was talking the talk, but clearly not walking the talk. So get your CEO to really embedded in what he's doing, he or she is doing. Talk about it at town halls. Put integrity and ethics into the core values. Get a designated chief compliance officer. The more buy-in you get from the senior leadership team, the better too. In some organizations, the CFO is the key person. But you've got to get it embedded in that SLT group and the board. And even better than just a tone from the top is one that's cascaded down to a tone from the middle. And so getting your CEO to really talk to the middle management and get them to embody it is critical. First and foremost, a lot of people get this wrong. First and foremost, the job of your chief compliance officer is not writing policies and procedures, but it's about being a great communicator, being an evangelist for ethics and integrity, being a salesman, and having clout with the board and the SLT. Okay, secondly, you've got to build an anti-bribery and compliance policy. But I'll tell you a little secret. A lot of companies get all hung up in, oh, we've got to create this new policy and it's going to take all this time and everything. The fastest and most effective way for smaller and medium-sized organizations to do this is just build it into their existing code of ethics or code of conduct policy. That way you can just add in a couple of pages and listen, every big company has a code of conduct policy. Borrow. Doesn't mean you steal. You just look at them and make it, so that it works for your organization. At the beginning of the code of ethics policy, and this ties into my earlier point, you need to get the CEO to have a lead-in so that your CEO is showing support for this policy. This is critical. And then don't just take your policy and stick it on the internet. And along with maybe a training program that's stuck on your internet and think, man, we're done, we're good. You've got to operationalize it. You've got to get that policy so that people are really, reading it, understanding it, talking about it. I've seen a lot of organizations where, it's the worst thing. They create a watertight policy full of legalese that no one reads or understands. Make it interesting, make your policy interesting, have pictures, have captions, have examples. Again, the job of a compliance officer is communication, not policy writing. I would often ask people, hey, where do you find the code of ethics policy? And if they hesitated, then I know we've got a problem. Everybody should know where it is and they should know what it says. Okay, thirdly, get training going immediately. Once you have the policy, once you have wording in your ethics policy about corruption, get the word out there. And this is again where you need your top people involved. Your CEO should, do a lead-in. I tried that when I was training on code of ethics. I would have a lead-in by the top executive in that office, and they would introduce the topic, say how important and critical this is to our organization, then introduce me. So you need them front and center. I've seen some organizations where the senior leadership team doesn't even show up to the training. What kind of optics is that? It's horrible. The great thing about in-person training, and I'm a big proponent of in-person training. Online training can be good too, and there's a place for it, but in-person training allows you to really get in there and tailor it to the specific office needs, risks. You allow for question and answer, and you really enable that kind of tone from the top and the tone from the middle to get across. I think it's also important, I was just going to make another point about, it's important to also tie in other aspects of code of ethics that really play a role in corruption and bribery. So, talk about anti-money laundering, talk about US sanctions, talk about, other regulations of the UK Bribery Act or Criminal Finances Act, insider trading, anti-competition laws, these all tie in together. It's rare that you see corruption and bribery stand alone with something else involved. So get people to understand what all these other regulations are, how they impact the organization, and how they tie in to corruption and bribery. That's really important. You want your people to know what these things are so that they can see when there's a red flag and call you. And that leads into the next point, which is you've got to have a whistleblower hotline and investigation process. And this is as well as critical. This is why this is listed as one of the top 5. You need to have this. And of course, this is mandated by the US stock exchanges anyway. But hotlines, a lot of people don't know this. They think, oh man, that's going to be so expensive and time consuming. Listen, I'm shocked at how reasonably priced it is to outsource a hotline. They can be outsourced for relatively cheap, and they're good. The companies that do this, they offer 24/7 manning of the call lines. They're independent. They track them. They record them. You've got, automatically you've got stuff you can give your audit committee, and they ensure anonymity so that, when you tell people, hey, listen, you're safe to call in, because that's people's biggest concerns, you've got it handled. So there really is no excuse for not having a proper hotline. And you need to then set up an investigation process to ensure that all reports are followed up quickly and objectively. One time I was, investigating fraud in the Philippines, and we found it, we terminated the person, and immediately the next day I was speaking at a conference to a bunch of employees, and I talked about this. I said, listen, you guys call into the hotline, this is what happens. We take action immediately and something happens, so please do it. And then in turn, we started getting more calls. Okay, fifthly, you need to do some due diligence or KYC, as some people call it, on your highest risk counterparties. This is really important. You need to just get a start on this. So for medium-sized organizations, I say, get your 1 or 2 biggest risk counterparties. You might only have 1 or 2 high risk ones, and do full due diligence on them. Record it so that you've got a good base to say, yes, we looked at these guys in depth, and we're okay to be working with these guys. Obviously, a supplier of stationary equipment in Vancouver is lower risk than a business development agent on commission in Venezuela with a headquarters in the British Virgin Islands. So you need to understand how different aspects of your counterparties play into the risk that they have. So you develop a risk matrix, and then lay out a plan for who you're going to target. And so you need to do some work. If it's high risk, you need to do more than you do for a lower risk one. You need to get out there and interview them, talk about them, do some research on the internet, see if they've had problems before, and really get in there. So things like agents or big joint ventures, integral supply chain, those are some of the things you look at. I realize I'm getting low on time, so I'm gonna blitz through the next 5. If you go to the next slide, these ones are less important, but still important. And like I said, if you can't get to them right away, you at least need to be able to show that you have a plan for getting to them. Okay, the first one is gifts and entertainment. Listen, in the authorities will often start with expense accounts, because that's how bribery and corruption often starts. It starts with a meal or a gift or an entertainment, and then they can often get bigger from there. You need to make sure that you have a really good program for handling gifts and entertainment. And I'm not just talking about giving, but receiving. You got to have both sides of it. You've got to make sure that you communicate the policy, that you track everything, that you get pre-approvals. This is a critical area, and one that must include your CEO and even your board chair, because those are often where the worst abuses can happen or the most temptation can happen. So your chief compliance officer needs to have authority to be able to report to the board, and even the CEO needs to get pre-approval for documentation purposes from chief compliance officer. Very important. Secondly, when you're bringing new employees into the company, new hires or M&A deals, you've got to get them immediately trained. There's no excuse for waiting a year or so to have new employees, new companies coming in through M&A trained. You've got to get training, and then you've got to make sure your training is then planned out to be done annually, biannually at least, but on a regular basis. And trust me, it's critical to have this recorded. You need to show who's there, and you need to have them tested if it's online, but you need to show who's there, what was talked about, have them sign in when they go. I've had to do this before where I've had to prove that such and such a person was at training because they got in trouble with the law, and we had to show that we weren't at fault because we trained them properly. They were at fault. They knew what they were doing was wrong. Thirdly, you've got to set up a due diligence program. So beyond your first one or two high-risk counterparties that you looked at, set up a compliance program. So every new company that comes in, put them through the grid of a risk assessment. Check for things like U.S. sanctioned countries. You've got to do some initial checks. Get them to fill out a checklist questionnaire. Most companies are used to that now. Make sure that they have a good compliance program, or if they don't have a code of ethics, that they embrace yours. Really important. The next one, 4, is set up a consistent disciplinary process. This is important because oftentimes, if you don't have a consistent disciplinary process, your incentive is to let the senior people kind of off the hook. Oh, well, they're a great employee, that was a one-off mistake, etc. And people want to turn away from it. This is important, and I won't talk about incentives because incentives are important, but I'm just running out of time. The last one is a risk assessment. Now, if you're a large organization and you have a lot of resources, you would probably start with this. But from what I've seen, this takes a fair amount of time, and you need to make sure that you do this, but it can wait. It can wait until you've got these critical things done, and then you go in and do a risk assessment and just make sure that all your high-risk schemes are properly mitigated. And that's it for me. Thanks for listening. And Norman?
Well, thank you, Paul, for that. Much appreciated. Great to hear that you were focusing on the importance of tone from the top. And I know this is a phrase that just gets repeated ad nauseum in a lot of these webinars, and just how important it is. And we often think that because you just say it, that somehow it's going to magically occur. My company in Brazil at the moment is working on a multi-million-dollar fraud and corruption investigation for a fairly large organization in Brazil. And a lot of the steps, Paul, that you outlined that companies should be following in order to have a fairly adequate anti-corruption program, it would appear at the moment as though this company wasn't really following too many of those steps at all. And this is a company that's been around for many years, very well organized, so it would seem. But again, things have fallen through the cracks. I think people have just assumed that things were going to be taken care of when in fact they weren't being taken care of, and their balance sheet is suffering for it. Now, I know that a lot of you out there in the audience today will have some questions of our speakers, and we've already had a couple that have come in. Thank you very much for that. There will be a period of a question and answer session and a panel discussion involving all four speakers at the end of our fourth speaker today. So if you could sort of just jot down some questions now and then fire them out at the end of the fourth speaker's presentation, then we can address all of those at that time. So thank you, Paul. Our next speaker is John Ritchie. John lives in Vancouver. He is the vice chair of the Integrity Management Committee of the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, also known as FIDIC. John has over 40 years of experience working as a civil engineer on water resources and hydropower projects in Canada, Australia, Thailand, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and India. John has been around, and he has developed and implemented the anti-corruption compliance system for Acres International, which is was a large engineering firm. He was also the compliance director for an engineering procurement and construction management team for a major liquid natural gas project in Australia. And he established and managed an anti-corruption compliance system for another LNG project in Australia. And until recently, John was on the board of directors of BC Hydro and Transparency International Canada. So he has been there and done that. So please pay attention to John when he speaks. And today he is going to be speaking on integrity and anti-corruption, a consulting engineer's perspective. John, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Norman, and thanks for Paul. Paul covered some very important points in developing anti-corruption compliance programs in SMEs, really any size of company. And in my involvement in the consulting engineering industry, and particularly through our international association, FIDIC, I've come to appreciate how our larger firms have established their own compliance programs and done very well at it. But the smaller firms, in many cases, needed help to determine just what kind of a system would work for them. And many of the problem areas that Paul mentioned come up with those firms. So I'll talk about this topic from the point of view of a consulting engineering firm, and talk about what our international association has done to help our members, especially the SMEs, to develop their own systems. So just in broad terms, we're going to talk about the industry, put it into a bit of perspective, and then I'll talk about our international association, FIDIC, which is an acronym based on the French term for the association, and talk about some of FIDIC's activities, starting from contracts and through to the work we've done on anti-corruption tools. And then I'll wrap up by talking about some of the experiences I've had in talking with people and firms about their objections to implementing integrity management systems, because we've had some frustration in trying to get major buy-in from our SME members. And I think this might be a useful topic later on because people for different reasons find different ways of avoiding action on this topic. So next slide, please. So I was a senior employee of a Canadian-based consulting firm, what would be classified as a medium enterprise. The firms in Canada, consulting firms, are an important part of the services sector. And in fact, our national association, ACEC, cites over 50,000 employees from over 400 member firms. I should clarify, ACEC is a business association and has no regulatory role. Membership is not mandatory, and it's in that area that some misunderstanding can occur, because people might say, well, why doesn't your association discipline a firm that has got in trouble with the law? The firm sizes range from what might be called a boutique firm, from between 5 and 20 employees serving a local market, all the way to very large firms, the firms we've all heard about because they're typically listed on the stock exchange. Next slide, please. FIDIC was founded in Europe in 1913, initially from a very small number of members. And since around 1950, it has become a really major organization headquartered in Switzerland. The formal definition of what FIDIC is all about is it's a global representative body for national associations of consulting engineers. In other words, it's an association of associations. It represents around 40,000 firms with 1 million employees. So this is major. We have associations that are members from Albania to Zimbabwe, Canada, the US, the UK, Kenya, South Africa are all members of FIDIC. It's an important point to note that the consulting engineering industry has grown dramatically in developing countries over the last approximately 30, 40 years. This is an important development. It's been encouraged by the IFIs, the international financial institutions, as an important component of building economies. But one feature that's important particularly in a bribery-prone environment is that the barriers to entry can be quite low for member firms, for small firms. A firm can start and finish very quickly. And that can lead to trouble when you're trying to compete against a firm like that. Next slide. A major part of FIDIC's activities is to develop and promote the use of model contracts. Ever since 1957, when the first one came out, it's called the Red Book. It's a contract that covers construction of typically an infrastructure project designed by the owner. And you see in the list, there's other types of contracts. One important one for the industry, the consulting industry, is the White Book. That is a model services agreement for clients and consultants. Now, FIDIC contracts are intended to be balanced. They're intended to be developed. They've been developed by users with a minimum of legalese, and they use a common format with standard general conditions and options to customize using particular conditions. And this format helps with training of engineers and owners who are using the contract on multiple projects. So it's a very useful thing, but the suite of contracts was considered to be incomplete when we started on our anti-corruption program. And so in particular, we developed one contract, which I'll mention in a few minutes. Next slide. So FIDIC became active in anti-corruption following the World Bank's introduction of its anti-corruption program. In 1996, that happened, and FIDIC was asked to respond. FIDIC considers the relationship with the World Bank to be really important, and with the other IFIs as well. So FIDIC was determined to present a positive response to this initiative by the World Bank. It began with something called the Business Integrity Management System, which was outlined as early as 1997 and presented to the bank in 1999. FIDIC was hoping that would be able to convince the World Bank that with widespread adoption of this system, the consulting engineering industry would be seen in a positive light by the World Bank in its anti-corruption programs. In FIDIC 2001, the first introduction to our members was made, and I was present at that meeting. And in fact, it was very useful to me to see this material, because very soon after that, I got involved in developing an integrity management system for my own firm. The Business Integrity Management System is now called FIMS, FIDIC Integrity Management System, to make it unique to FIDIC. And then the Integrity Management Committee under the FIDIC committee structure is responsible for developing integrity management tools and promoting integrity management among the member firms. Next slide. So here's the FIDIC approach to integrity management, and it's not at variance with the standards that were mentioned by Paul, but it is intended to tune into the unique characteristics of the consulting industry. We follow the project cycle from the concept to completion of projects and recognize risks all along the way in that cycle. We focus on the positive and prevent the negative. The positive is fulfilling the obligations of what FIDIC constantly refers to as a trusted advisor. Paul mentioned the definition of corruption as being a misuse of entrusted power for private gain. Well, the trusted advisor is something that a concept we want to present to our clients, that they can trust us. Well, of course, if you are viewed as a firm that resorts to bribery to get your work, or to manipulate claims from contractors and so on, how can they call you a trusted advisor? So fulfill the obligations of the trusted advisor, and then protect your firm against the possibility of bribery, corrupt employees, and third parties. That's the negative part is really what we're trying to talk about, Paul's trying to talk about. So we've documented the FIMS in 3 different publications, FIMS 1, 2, and 3. And FIMS 3 is available for download for free from FIDIC. And I think it's useful, and I hope people will find it interesting. FIMS 3 compares and contrasts FIMS and the new ISO anti-bribery standard, ISO 37001. It's really intended to show a firm that already has a FIMS how they would go about becoming registered as compliant with ISO 37001. And lastly, the model representative agreement, which is what I mentioned. This is the contract that we felt would be beneficial to our members to help them with managing a relationship with a representative. Next slide. So here in these next couple of slides, and you'll have access to these slides, we talk about the model representative agreement, and it's meant to protect the consultant against the misuse of the relationship and the funds that he obtains through commissions of a representative. Now, there are many legitimate reasons for having a representative in a foreign country where you don't understand all the rules, but it's certainly been proven that representatives or agents operating on behalf of any firm, but including consulting firms, have been guilty of paying bribes. And particularly the commission arrangement is vulnerable to that. Next slide. So the model representative agreement gives a consultant a basis for a reasonably balanced agreement with a representative, but it has clear anti-corruption provisions. Next slide. So in our program to promote the adoption of FIMS, our committee has been a bit frustrated by the slow uptake of the system, and so we implemented a pilot program in 2010 and found we had designated 6 firms who didn't have a FIMS to implement them and just see how things went. This was a 2-year process, and it helped us with our FIMS 2 document. Next slide. The design of any integrity management system, as Paul has mentioned, should be scalable. It should be adaptable, should be tuned to the risks that you have, and it should be based on integrity as the foundation of your firm's intentions. Next slide. We found that firms experience different levels of success. Some firms completely changed their client base, effectively fired clients representing integrity risk, which in many ways is what you have to do, I think, when you confront corruption. Some of them didn't survive leadership changes. As Paul mentioned, you need to have tone from the top, and if the top changes and the new CEO isn't going to support the FIMS, it could wither on the vine. And one company actually adopted a totally non-negotiable integrity system, which may have meant some difficulties in compliance. Next slide. So just to wrap up, a few things. These are objections I've heard about integrity management systems. And I've heard this from companies I've worked for. I've heard it from companies I've spoken with at conferences. And so I think these are the kind of comments you do hear. Oh, we serve a local market. There's no integrity risks here. Well, in response, I might say, well, okay, what do your clients want? Do they want you to ensure that you don't violate their gift to employees rules? That's an integrity risk if you violate them. Oh, we're a small firm. We can't afford more overhead costs. I've heard that many times. Here's another one. Our employees will think we don't trust them if we have an integrity management system. Or our clients won't like it because it makes it look like we don't trust our employees. And then, of course, the old one, if we have a problem, we'll deal with it when it happens. Bad things never happen to me. Well, you know that if an integrity problem hits your company, it will be very expensive to deal with it. And then there's the old when in Rome argument. Next slide. So where do we go from here? And this is one of the things that we keep asking ourselves at the Integrity Management Committee. Our large firms typically have large, strong, legally based compliance programs. Experience for them or competitors has been an unkind teacher. Many of our small and medium firms don't perceive high risks and lack of reward in taking a proactive approach. They think this is an insurance policy against what they regard as a very small risk. And at least in Canada, very little enforcement of anti-corruption law means that we haven't created much of a fear factor. The only recent example is SNC-Lavalin case, but many firms think that couldn't apply to them. So, carrot or stick? Do we aspire to do the right thing, or is a fear factor needed? And I hope we can have some discussion of some of these points. Back to you, Norman.
Terrific. Thank you, John. Greatly appreciated for sharing your many years of insight and experience with our audience today. We have been receiving a number of questions from the audience, and I'll remind you again that at the end of the fourth presentation, there's two more to go, we will be addressing those questions, and I'll ask all four of the panelists to have a crack at answering them. Our next speaker is Yulia Kovalenko. Yulia is based in Toronto, and she is a business integrity team manager at Export Development Canada, which is a federal government agency that supports and develops Canada's export trade by helping companies to promote business ethics, use the competitive advantages they need to succeed internationally, and have access to the EDC Anti-Corruption Resource Center. And I'm hoping that Yulia will expand on that particular facility. She was formerly a trade and economic advisor for Global Affairs Canada and a senior associate in the Toronto office of Kroll, which is the well-known multinational corporate investigations and risk consulting firm. As a leader in responsible business, Yulia has a deep understanding of how to overcome the challenges that Canadian companies face to navigate the complexities of international trade while maintaining the highest standards of business ethics and integrity. And I am really looking forward to hearing what she has to say about Canadian SMEs and how Export Development Canada helps them to manage third-party risk related to corruption. So Yulia, it's all yours.
Thank you very much, Norm, and pleasure to be here today. Great insights from Paul and John today. I would like to go from general to specifics and talk about third-party risk today, but maybe before I do that, I'd like to say a few words about EDC, Export Development Canada. Next slide, please. So as Canada's export credit agency, we do have a unique perspective on the topics that we discussed today. And Norm asked me to comment about SMEs. We do serve more than 5,000 small and medium-sized companies in Canada every year. Their annual sales go from 2 million to up to 50 million. So this is how we define the SME segment. And of course, we are a government agency, but we are also at the intersection of international trade because we serve Canadian companies who export abroad. And so for us, responsible business practices is not only how we choose to operate internally within EDC. Responsible business is also an integral part of our mandate. And as a Crown corporation, we want our customers, Canadian exporters, to be the champions in responsible business practices. And that's because they don't simply export goods or services, they also export Canada's brand. And this is very important. At the same time, we don't see ourselves, and I don't see myself, in a role that is simply limited to setting the tone or just holding theoretical discussions on values and ethics. I see myself as a practitioner working alongside Canadian companies and helping them tackle many challenges of international trade. Corruption and bribery are certainly one of them. And from where I sit, it is still one of the greatest barriers to international trade. I think speakers before me already mentioned disruption to fair competition, but ultimately the price is much higher. It's the social and economic inequality in the world. On this slide here, you see how EDC defines responsible and sustainable business. It is based on 4 pillars. My team represents the dark red segment, business integrity, but there are 3 other pillars, which are environment and human rights, local communities, and our people. And this also represents the vision that we have for Canada and for Canadian exporters. Next slide, please. All right. So in thinking about topics that I could talk about today, I really didn't need to think twice. And really looking back at my week at work, I know that there is one topic that is equally top of mind for companies of all sizes, whether big or small, first-time exporters or global players. When it comes to international trade, companies of all sizes, but SMEs in particular, find themselves relying on many services provided by third parties. For example, customs brokers who help move goods across the borders, or local distributors who market and sell products in countries around the world, lawyers who help navigate local regulations, and so on and so forth. Third parties are essential to international business and expansion into global markets. We all understand that, but they can also put your entire business at risk. Why? The answer is quite simple. Because current anti-corruption laws and compliance standards make companies responsible for third parties that they engage, and they're liable for their conduct if they offer, pay, promise improper advantages to government officials, or engage in other forms of corruption. And when it comes to my discipline, third-party risk is probably also one of the areas that is the most challenging for compliance professionals. But I would say don't discourage just yet. We'll talk about some practical solutions as well. Next slide, please. So how serious is this risk? I find that there's nothing more sobering than numbers. And here's what the enforcement statistics around the world tell us about the risk related to third parties, and the risk of being penalized for bribery and corruption committed by a third party. Since the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention came into force in 1999, 1 in 2 enforcement actions around the world was a result of bribery committed by sales agents, intermediaries, brokers, other third parties. In the United States, the global leader in anti-corruption law enforcement, 90% of all cases brought under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act involved a third-party intermediary. And the penalties are very stiff. In Canada, the largest penalty imposed to date under the Canadian of Foreign Public Officials Act was about 10 million. And that case involved corrupt payments through an intermediary in Chad. And even if this amount sounds like a death penalty to a small company, this is still a fraction of an average penalty in the United States for violations under their Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And given the extraterritorial reach of the US law and the significant footprint of Canadian companies there, these statistics should not be disregarded. Next slide, please. Well, I guess this is enough of theory on my part and the fear factor, as John just mentioned. Let's talk about practical steps that companies can take to effectively manage risks related to third parties. You'll see here a chart that I borrowed from Transparency International and their report on best practices for third-party risk management. I love it because it helps visualize the 7 components of a sound third-party risk management program. But I also do realize that while I can be very fond of this chart as an anti-bribery practitioner, it can actually have the opposite effect with a different audience. It's way too complex, well too overwhelming. Small companies and first-time exporters that I work with on a daily basis often ask what they can start with without feeling overwhelmed. And I really like to make it simple for them. I usually break it down into simple concepts, these 4 concepts that you see on the right side. Take a risk-based approach, identify red flags, set expectations, and establish controls. These concepts convey the key information, really, that you need to know in plain English without using any of the industry jargon, such as KYC, financial crimes, enhanced due diligence, risk mitigation. These are really simple concepts, and they should also really resonate with anyone who has ever retained a third-party service to assist, let's say, with some household chores. So let me maybe use a more practical example even. Let's say that this week you move to a new house and you need to get internet installed and also hire a nanny for a little one. Both are absolutely critical because you work from home and schools are closed. I think it resonates with some of us for sure. So the internet problem is easy to fix, takes a couple of minutes, but the choice of a nanny requires more careful consideration. And this is what I call a risk-based approach. In the corporate context, this could mean, for example, prioritizing third parties in emerging markets, or maybe looking closer at intermediaries dealing with government officials. Let's continue with this nanny example. So let's say you've identified a couple of candidates that you want to interview. You ask for their bio or resume to review the work experience, but you also ask for a police report to make sure that there's no prior criminal history. You also Google their name to see what kind of information pops up. Apply this exact approach to your intermediaries in foreign markets, and I'd say you are almost covered for third-party risk. In my experience, really, in the day-to-day, the information is usually at your fingertips. Type the name of your agent intermediary in Google, add words like corruption, bribery, money laundering, fraud, etc., and here you go. Really, as unsophisticated or even unprofessional as it may sound, Google, social media platforms, and blogs can be a much better source of information in some parts of the world, in many emerging markets. And it gives you more than some of the most expensive databases that I have access to at EDC, for example. And really, the reason is because in a lot of countries, information is simply unavailable because there are no e-government technologies that make public records easily accessible. And then partly due to the oppression of free press and independent journalism. So using Google is not so unprofessional or unsophisticated after all. Let's go to the nanny example. So you made your choice and you want to discuss certain formalities. Before hiring a nanny, I'm sure you discuss some house rules and values that you feel are important to you. Do exactly the same with your intermediaries. And better yet, ask them to sign a compliance certificate that outlines your expectations for their conduct. John just mentioned that there are a lot of off-the-shelf products that you can borrow or buy for very little fee. And finally, compensation. Not the least important detail with your nanny or with your intermediaries. You want to make sure that their compensation is comparable to market prices. But you would probably also raise an eyebrow if 1 month your nanny asks you for an increase, supposedly for some additional services. Clear compensation structures and payment methods are critical when it comes to agents, third parties, intermediaries, because you really don't want part of their fees to be directed to an account of a government official, for example, who is also coincidentally responsible for awarding your firm a contract. So I hope that by using this practical example, it was helpful to illustrate a few critical points in risk management without making it overly complicated. And I'm sure that these measures are not cost prohibitive to small companies. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, I would like to go back to some statistics and really reflect on this question of whether responsible business is good for business. Norm has already mentioned the monetary cost of corruption, and really it is extremely high. According to some of the OECD reports on foreign bribery, in some industries, bribes can go up to 20% of the transaction value. But even beyond these costs that you will have to find ways to offset, companies' bottom lines can also be substantially impacted by fines and penalties. But really, after all, like ultimately, the human costs of corruption are even higher. Besides the tangible assets, reputational damage can be equally devastating to the bottom line and shareholder value, and potentially much harder or even impossible to recover from. And in the world of Twitter and other social media platforms, as we all know from a few recent examples, reputation is indeed your most valuable asset. And finally, while corruption can still be viewed as a cost of doing business in some parts of the world, the generational shifts that are currently underway will continue to put pressure on global value chains and demand greater transparency, ethics, sustainability. So really, business integrity will remain key to long-term success of your company. I think I will wrap it up here. The next slide gives you a link to EDC's Anti-Corruption Resource Center. And really, it just gives you some high-level ideas of where to start. But in my day-to-day, I work with hundreds of exporters in helping them become aware of risks and also start working on how to manage and mitigate them. Norm, back to you.
Well, thank you, Yulia, for that presentation. That was super. Great to hear that you focus so much on third-party risk and the due diligence that underlines it. I spend most of my professional days working on that exact same topic. So it was great that you dove into it as deeply as you did. And also the Anti-Corruption Resource Center supplied by EDC. I hope that several of our participants will take advantage of the services that the center provides. Our final speaker today comes all the way from Nairobi, Kenya, where he is based. And this is James Mwangi. He is the CEO of Current Technologies, which is working on various energy and oil and gas projects in East and Central Africa, and is also producing studies for LNG, solar, wind power, and electricity transmission projects in that same region. James has held key roles for over 30 years in the energy and oil and gas sectors, and he recently joined the board of directors of the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, or FIDIC, as we mentioned earlier. He is the chairman of the FIDIC Integrity Management Committee, as well as the Private Sector Initiative Against Corruption through the Multi-Sectoral Forum. And James is also past chairman of the Association of Consulting Engineers of Kenya. And today he is going to give us an African perspective on how SMEs reduce corruption. James, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Norman. I must start by apologizing because we've just had a power outage. So that doesn't help us. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. So thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be part of today's panel, and especially to talk on this very important topic of corruption. We have our very major challenges in Africa. And today I just want to take you through a perspective that will just show, this part of the world, what we're dealing with. So I'll just briefly touch through corruption. I think, Norman, you have defined it. Prevalent forms of corruption, causes of corruption, effects of corruption, and proposed anti-corruption measures in general, and then question and answer. Next slide, please. Forgive me if you don't see me very well because my camera is not well adjusted. Corruption is a major concern to our country here in Kenya and indeed Africa. And it is a major threat to socioeconomic aspirations in Africa. And whereas Africa has a fast-growing entrepreneurial middle class, faster growth and poverty reduction is hampered by corruption. Next slide, please. And some numbers were mentioned. The numbers that I was able to pick up last year, IMF estimated that $1 trillion were lost every year to corruption. And World Bank estimates that corruption adds approximately 10% worldwide on the cost of doing business. So we have 10% being lost, meaning that 10% value is lost in transactions, etc. And then in Africa, the African Union estimates about $140 billion is lost per year through corruption in Africa. And to put this into perspective, it costs only $55 billion per year to ensure every citizen in Africa has got electricity or lights on a 24-hour basis. The Afrobarometer report states that a third of Africans actually paid bribes last year. That is a huge population, meaning that bribery and corruption has become a way of life. Next slide, please. And then just to put it into perspective, as mentioned, Transparency International has come out with their latest corruption perception indices. And if you look at the 15 worst corrupt countries in Africa, it's sad to note that the bottom two, in fact, most of the bottom countries come from Africa. So the bottom country there tying is South Sudan and Somalia, closely followed by Sudan, which is the country that South Sudan broke off, and then goes all the way. We see countries here that are rich in minerals, rich in resources. Democratic Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, we have Mozambique and other countries, rich, Nigeria, rich with minerals and other resources, taking those very low positions or positions that depict them as extremely corrupt. Next slide, please. On the flip side, the best 15 countries, we have Seychelles, position 27 out of 180, Botswana, a few other countries, Rwanda, Mauritius. My country, Kenya, is not doing very well at the bottom there, 124. Still a lot of work to be done. Next slide, please. Right, so who is involved? In general, same old players, government, and what we call county are the state governments, elected officials, politicians, the judiciary, You want to buy justice. And sadly, professionals, lawyers, engineers, investigators, prosecutors, and others. And then, of course, the supply side of corruption, private sector, employees, and as said, also members of the public, primarily trying to seek service or favors from government or other bodies. Next. And the institutions, public institutions that have been known to be highly corrupt. The police, because everybody wants to get out of potentially being convicted or potentially being penalized for something that they've done wrong. So it is easier, it is low amount of money. But the sad thing is that it fuels the culture of corruption. Government officials are meant to give out government services. They see to it that people pay for it, members of parliament, business executives on the supply side. We have presidents and prime ministers, as was mentioned by Paul. It starts at the top, the CEO of the country. And if he doesn't embrace anti-corruption, then you've got a problem. Judges and magistrates selling justice, not creating a level playing field in the judicial system. Local government, what we mean by local government are the smaller town governments. Traditional leaders, because Africa, we still have tribes, we still have ethnic groups. Non-governmental organizations funded by foreign institutions, seeking favors, etc. And then sadly, religious leaders wanting to benefit from the gravy train. Next. What forms of corruption? Mentioned earlier, fraud, meaning cheating, bribery, tax evasion, embezzlement, extortion, abuse of office, favoritism, procurement, very fertile ground for corruption because a lot of expenditure in these countries is through government, public services, public projects, etc. Next slide, please. What causes corruption in Africa and perhaps other places in the developing world? One is political patronage. So, and political patronage, you're talking about power. Power to allocate resources, power to allocate favors, and other things. And therefore, people pay for political patronage. Then, of course, poor governance, lack of political will. Because as mentioned, if the top doesn't embrace the fight against corruption, then it is difficult to cascade that culture down to other members of the country or citizens. Breakdown or erosion of societal values and norms. These sadly has continued to erode behavior patterns all geared towards fueling corruption and accepting, normalizing behavior, a bad behavior. And then weak absence of management system, procedures and practices, misuse of discretionary power vested in individuals and offices, weak civil society and general apathy. A lot of times people don't feel like there is any benefit in fighting corruption. People seem not to understand that what is actually being stolen, especially from the government, is public money. It is money belonging to the citizens. So people are sometimes ill-concerned. They don't bother too much, not knowing that in doing so, then they lack the services, etc. Lack of professional integrity, code of ethics not being followed, not being there, lack of transparency and accountability, tribalism, favoritism, nepotism, employing people that you know, cronyism, very prevalent. And sadly, you will find in some countries that politics revolves around this, revolves around ethnic groups, etc. Inefficient public service, perhaps because they're not well paid, and therefore they will use their positions to try and survive. And then just sheer greed, and then not enforcing the law. Next slide, please. So what is the effects? Of course, they are dire. Poor health services. So when you have COVID coming in, it's really, really painful. Poor transport and communication networks, that includes roads, reduced investment and relocation of investors to other countries. Of course, if you find that there's high corruption and you're a foreign investor, you have a choice as to which country you would want to invest in. And you will find that many investors will shy away from countries that are very corrupt, unless they themselves are corrupt and would like to benefit from that kind of system. Delay, denial, and sale of justice in courts, extremely unfair. People finding out sometimes that they need to take the law in their hands because they won't get justice. The next one is increased poverty. Very, very sad, because people become poorer. When people become poorer, they will affect everybody, including those who have. Shoddy, stalled projects, unemployment, loss of confidence in government, rise in crime and insecurity, negative international image, inflated consumer prices, minimized tax revenue as corruption fosters tax evasion, and then the uncertainty of economic transactions. So very dire consequences of corruption. Next slide, please. So a few measures that, from where I sit, could help in this fight against corruption. There are many measures, but these are just some of them. Well, the one thing that we would like to do is to increase the use of technology so that you can improve on accountability and transparency. We need systems where you are able to generate data, information, share it, and where there is less susceptibility of human beings manipulating and changing stuff. So use of technology, very, very important. And of course, in tracing perhaps where some of these monies are or where they're going to. And then invest in institutions and policies that ensure professionalism and independence of public institutions, very key. Because most of these major corruption transactions, there has to be a professional. It's not just done by a layman. It's done by an educated man or lady who knows the systems and also knows ways and means to bypass that system. And then, of course, the public institutions, especially talking about judiciary, talking about investigative institutions, the police, they need to be independent, not institutions that can be swayed or work at the behest of corrupt individuals, including politicians. And then it was mentioned about incentives and align anti-corruption measures with the market, behavioral and social forces. People must be able to see that there is benefit in fighting corruptions. And then, of course, sanctions. Pain matters. And that is why it is important for these institutions to be independent so that people don't get away with it when they are caught. For the small and medium-sized firms, there is need, obviously, to adopt international integrity systems. In other words, adopt already established systems. Don't reinvent the wheel. Use what is out there that is working and working well, and simply just localize it. Next, please. Then act globally and locally. Keep citizens engaged. Like I said, they need to know that this is their fight, it is their benefit. Make use of the architecture that has been developed and platforms that exist for engagement. Learn by doing. I think that was mentioned previously earlier. You've got to implement it, monitor it, evaluate the progress. And then, of course, on the supply side of corruption, highlight the importance of private sector working in partnership with the public sector to reduce graft, and everybody benefits that way. Next slide, please. So small and medium-sized businesses, to add on to what the previous speakers have said, we've got to put in in place anti-corruption, anti-bribery systems and procedures, including whistleblowing, as was mentioned. Avoid and limit cash transactions. This is very prevalent. In my country, they have put in measures now. There's a limit as to the amount of money that you can extract from the bank without giving an explanation. There's also a limit onto the amount that you can deposit in cash without an explanation. And that explanation, if not found to be credible, the banks will refuse to take your money, and then you'll have to look for other ways of using that money. Seek professional advice about compliance and anti-bribery. Awareness and sensitization on the anti-bribery legislation. My country has just put in place Anti-Bribery Act based on the British Anti-Bribery Act. And now we are developing the regulations to operationalize that act to try and address corruption on the supply side. Licenses, again, putting in systems so that application of licenses and renewal doesn't attract or make it conducive for people to ask for bribes. And then it has been mentioned about gifts and receiving and giving and receiving gifts. And this is a tough one because in our culture, giving a gift and receiving a gift is done for cultural reasons. But now people have expanded that, and there seems to be a blurred line as to the reason of giving. Sometimes it's not really cultural, it's because somebody wants something else. Compliance training for top management, that was said. Next slide. Thank you very much. And apologies that my camera was not working. Thank you.
Well, thank you, James, for that presentation about SMEs in Africa and corruption in Africa. I had the opportunity many, many years ago to live and work in Africa, working on some mining projects there. And of course, combining that with my many years in Latin America, a lot of what you said is something that I've had to experience firsthand every day as a way of life there. So thank you very much for that. Now, we do have some questions from the audience, which we would like to get to. But first, I just wanted to ask Carol Liao, who is the director for the Center of Business Law at the Peter A. Allard School of Law at the University of British Columbia, just to give some brief closing remarks, and then don't run away. Right after that, we will get to some of the questions that the participants have sent in, and I'll ask all four participants to have a go at answering those questions. So if I could ask Carol now, just to give us her closing remarks, and then we can get to the questions.
Oh, sure, thanks. And you know what, I'm so thrilled that we're going to keep going. I know it's extended a little bit on the time, but it's just such valuable information that's being provided here, and that was just absolutely fantastic. So thank you to our wonderful panelists, to Yulia, James, John, Paul, and to Norman for the fabulous moderating. It's fantastic. So, you know, with over 1.4 million SMEs in Canada and 400 million around the world that are employing billions of people and accounting for the majority of economic output from our business sector, this topic of integrity and corruption prevention tailored to the distinct needs of SMEs is so important. And, you know, while obviously corruption is detrimental to all types of companies, it does pose particular challenges for small firms. And this panel contributes to access to justice by filling that knowledge gap that can persist. And I, for one, am just so grateful that we're making this recording publicly available for all to view. And that we're going to even pass the time to still have question and answer and have that available too. So I'm glad to do that. And thank you for accommodating me, because I do have to run to teach right after. But you know, as this is the first in a series of so many of the wonderful events the Anti-Corruption Law Program has lined up for 2021, I do want to take a moment to just recognize my dear colleague and Professor Joe Weiler, and also John Ritchie, Paul Townsend, Norman, Danielle, and all the contributors and incredible team behind the program. I also want to thank everyone for coming on behalf of them and the Center for Business Law, Transparency International Canada, and iClear. This pandemic has certainly exacerbated corruption risks, and so corruption prevention, and particularly the knowledge that the anti-corruption law program will share throughout 2021 is so important. And, while this pandemic keeps us apart, it also brings us together in many ways, like through this virtual program and us being able to connect all around the world. With that, thank you very much. And, if you want updates on the upcoming events, please sign up to the Center for Business Law newsletter, which is available online, and certainly as well with our partners, TI Canada and iClear. I'm grateful to everyone for coming, and thank you for allowing me to have these little remarks here, but also just such appreciation to the panelists and these experts for bringing this knowledge to us. Thanks so much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Carol. Greatly appreciated for those comments. And I hope you have a good class.
Thank you so much.
Okay. We have some questions now that have come in from the audience, and I'd like to get to some of them in the time that we have left. A couple of the people sent in more or less the same questions, so I'm glad to see that people are thinking along the same lines. The first one that I'd like to ask, and this, again, I'll throw this open to sort of all of our panel. This comes from Susan Cote-Freeman. It's a great question, and it was sort of touched on briefly in some of the presentations, but I think we can get into it a bit more deeply here, and that is, what role can or should large companies play in motivating SMEs that are part of their supply chains to adopt sound anti-corruption policies and procedures? Now, I know that obviously that when you're taking on a third party, you want them to sign certain documents and so forth that say they're going to follow this and follow that. But I think that this is more just done out of a regulatory requirement, some bureaucratic necessity, rather than actually part of a more ethical policy or stance that the company should be adopting. So I'll throw that question out to whoever wants to take it.
It's Paul here, Norman.
Okay.
I'll jump in and I'll give a bit of a perspective from the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network, because this was really critical. The MACN, as we call it, we had some big players like BP, Shell, Maersk, and even TK, who were instrumental in getting a lot of the smaller companies to come along, and we didn't strong arm them, but we certainly, put some pressure on them to say, listen, if you're going to be part of our supply chain, you need to have a strong compliance program, and you need to come alongside. And part of that means being part of the Maritime Anti-Corruption Network. So we did that, and that really spurred the growth of the MACN to become a larger organization. So then the effects of that started really cascading, because then when we went to ports around the world, like in Africa, Nigeria, etc., to be able to say, hey, we've got 150 of the largest shipping companies in the world who want to be able to come into your port and not be faced with this pressure to give bribes and being put under duress. And listen, if you don't do this, this is going to have implications for your country and your ports, because we as a group of shipping companies won't want to do business with you. So, it started with these big companies putting pressure on other companies, and then it ended up having these huge implications for us being able to pressure governments. So that's just an example.
Super. Thank you, Paul. If there's anybody else on the panel that wants to dive in with their comments, there's sort of a second question. This one comes from Roy Cullen, and it actually ties in quite nicely with what you were just saying, Paul. And Roy asks, how can an SME, the management, how can it convince its sales personnel that they may have to walk away from a big sale because a bribe is required? Especially when you know already that the competition for this transaction is going to happily pay the bribe. So, and again, I think Yulia probably has some knowledge about this and how she sort of counsels Canadian SMEs who have to go overseas, and James would certainly be aware of this as well. If you're an SME, you're wanting to do business in another country, almost certainly you're going to have to hire the services of an agent. And that in itself could involve a bribe, or the agent will have to somehow maybe bribe someone in order to get the contract. How do you coach companies to deal with that situation?
Let me make a couple of remarks to start things off. I'm sure others will have something to say. I think it's all about business planning. There are usually red flags that you should see very early in your process of planning to pursue a certain project. The red flags will be there about hints you receive about needing an agent to complete this job, to win the project. And so it makes sense to ensure that as a company, you don't commit too many resources to pursuing a given opportunity until you've cleared it within your own company that this is a likely opportunity and that you can pursue it without having to pay bribes. So watching for the red flags early on, don't commit too much money until you are confident that you can proceed. Okay, other comments? Yulia, you may have something here.
Yes, I do, but I'm not sure if you can hear me because my screen just froze. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you, yes.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Yeah, I think, you know what, I think the most important thing in where all companies should start is really by acknowledging the risk and characterizing the risk. And to be honest, I'm not convinced that all companies of all sizes need some sort of written policy or code of conduct. We have companies who have 2 to 3 employees, they export, and they tell us we don't need a code of conduct. And I would agree with that, as long as you have conversations on a regular basis about what the risk is, what the consequences are, and are we all on the same page about what it means for the company, but also for me personally, because for small companies, it comes down to your personal reputation as well. And I'll give you an example of a firm that came up with a very ingenious way of dealing with some of these conversations in foreign markets where they have to go and meet with public officials. I mean, it has nothing to do with compliance standards, compliance practices. It has more to do with psychology. But really, I'll mention this example because it shows how small companies can be actually very proactive and inventive about how they approach it. So there's small company that I dealt with a few years ago that said, look, when we go and meet with public officials in foreign markets, our rule is no sit-down meetings. We don't sit down in closed offices with government officials. And surprisingly, it works because psychologically, I guess, people are less comfortable when they're standing up, when there are no closed doors. And really, it sounds simple, but ultimately it shows that the company had conversations internally about the principles, values, and ethics that they have. And then I would say that, things happen. Compliance programs are not meant to be bulletproof systems. And I think when things do happen, hopefully not all the way down to penalties, charges, etc., but do a bit of a post-mortem, discuss what happened, why, and what you can do about it. So for me, it's all about communication and really acknowledging that the risks are present, because it is surprising how little people do talk about it internally.
That was terrific. I'd never actually thought about the sit down, stand up meeting before. It's the things you learn. Thank you, Yulia.
Can I make a comment, Norman?
Yes, please, James, go ahead.
What we have done, at least in my company, is trained people to see the value of doing clean business. And that means also profiling our customers and knowing that there are some, even if they invite you to quote for work, we will not quote because we realize that By doing so, you will probably never ever win work on account of the fact that you are not willing to give bribes. And what we have done is then align ourselves with companies that have got integrity. And that makes our life easier because the transactions are transparent. You don't have to scratch your head over the next step. You just need to deliver the services that you have agreed. And the companies will pay you and pay you as required through the negotiated payment terms. Otherwise, it is once you go down the road of giving bribes, you just find out that you just get deeper and deeper and deeper into it until at some time you just see you can't just get out. The other thing is that we try and train our staffs to realize that you don't want to go down that road, because then you will do everything else in your life in a corrupt manner. If you see anything going wrong, or if you realize that you can bribe a policeman and get away with overspeeding or overtaking on wrong lanes, then you will do it because you realize there's no penalty, but it is actually endangering you. So we try and show people the value of doing business with firms that embrace integrity. And there are many that embrace integrity. It's only that they don't blow their trumpet probably loud enough. Thank you.
Wow, terrific insight there, James. Thank you very much. We have another question that has come in from Justin Bailey. He's actually asked a couple of questions, but there was one that he asked which was quite apropos to what Paul was talking about, although I think probably Yulia and John would have a word or two about this one as well. And that is certainly one of the measures, relatively inexpensive at that, that a company can adopt in order to combat corruption is a whistleblower channel. Could be technology, could be a hotline, but there has to be some way for staff to anonymously highlight what they consider to be some form of irregular activity that's going on. Could be fraud, could be a corruption, but it's something that is deleterious to the operations of the business. However, on the flip side of that, we're seeing backlash against whistleblowers. So I just wanted to ask our panelists how they would, in their own companies, or what they would recommend to people, to their clients, about the possibility of whistleblower backlash.
Yeah, I can jump in, Norman, on that one. I have a lot of experience dealing with hotlines, and I think that's why I'm such a big proponent of outsourcing your hotline. You automatically ensure that it's anonymous, because part of the contract that you have when you set it up with an external company is that they're not going to provide you any names, and so there automatically can't be any backlash. And I think then what you have to do is you have to make sure that you re-emphasize that continuously. You got to get out, you got to communicate the hotline, you got to say that it's anonymous, you got to prove that it's anonymous. And you almost have to work on the opposite side, which is, you know, when you show how beneficial it is when people blow the whistle, show that this has impacts on the organization, it improves our standing in the global community, it helps us. So show the real benefits of somebody blowing the whistle, and clearly show that there's not a downside. It's actually against the law too. So to not remain somebody as anonymity if they want to. So make that clear too, that we have to keep your name hidden if you want it to be that way.
Super. Any other comments from any of the other panelists? Okay, so there we go, John.
Yeah, just going back to the question about letting your sales staff know that they can walk away from a project. Again, I think this comes from the whole process of strategic planning for your organization. And within FIDIC, we've been trying to promote the positive concept of qualifying yourself as a trusted advisor. And essentially what we're suggesting to our companies is you don't want to be a bottom feeder. you will do better as a company, you will make better profits, you will build a reputation with potential employees if you operate with integrity. And that may mean firing some clients. It may mean deciding that certain areas of business are businesses that you want to close down. But and that can be a very difficult decision, and your sales staff might be unhappy about it. But if you achieve a consensus within your company that this should be part of your business plan, then you will, I think you will show that you can aspire to be a better company. That's my comment on that one.
That's it's a great comment. And I worked with a bank many years ago in Brazil that ended up losing customers for a short period of time when they enacted a new policy, which was essentially, we're not going to be funding or investing in companies that have essentially unethical or environmentally hazardous operations. And they did lose some business, but they promoted the fact that they lost business. And that in turn attracted other companies to that bank, which was an interesting, maybe a slightly risky bit of marketing, but it worked for them. Yulia, I have a question for you, and this is regarding the EDC's Anti-Corruption Resource Center. We've been talking a lot about how companies should be doing this and should be doing that. But where is this information available? Where can I now Paul mentioned one particular source, which is excellent, where they can follow step 1, step 2. But the Anti-Corruption Resource Center, if you could just speak a little bit more at length about, what it is it unique among Canadian government agencies? Who can access its materials? What sort of resources does it offer? And finally, if you've got time, have you seen where companies have taken that information or resources that are available through the center and actually made a difference and succeeded?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the resource center is publicly available. Anyone can access it. It's on EDC's website. You don't need to sign up or register. It's just there. You can just Google EDC Anti-Corruption Resource Center and it's there. But really, it's just the tip of the iceberg of what we can provide to companies that we work with. Really, most of the conversations and help that we do provide to Canadian companies, it happens in bilateral conversations. Of course, it is challenging for us to, there's a difference between helping and helping to the point where it's not helpful anymore. And what I mean by that is that we have hundreds and hundreds of companies that we deal with on a daily basis. We don't know all of your businesses, your operations, your culture, your staff. So first of all, only you within your company is well positioned to know what the risks are, what are the better strategies to address them. So it must be your responsibility. And really the tone and the message cannot come from EDC if you want it to be well received. It should come from within. The second point is, of course, some legal considerations that we have, potential legal liabilities. We cannot take on the role of advising companies on what they should do with their risk management, third-party risk management. So there are these considerations as well. But really, day to day, we talk to hundreds of companies, and we have a lot of success stories, and it doesn't only come to business integrity, anti-corruption, supply chain management, ethical standards. It also comes down to other sustainable business practices, so people and environment, local communities. And I have a ton of success stories where small companies having operations, really small operations overseas in Indonesia, I can think of, where they wanted to manage their supply chain responsibly. They didn't know where to start. We worked with them really closely, hand in hand, and they were able to accomplish amazing things. And when I look at our customer base, Canadian companies are, they export Canadian brand, and it is important. Even starting with the types of goods and technologies that we help them market internationally, a lot of them actually, in and on themselves, have positive impacts. Software technologies that help manage public resources, public finances, companies that export environmental cleanup related technologies. Really, it starts with goods, services, how you do it, and ultimately, what do you want your reputation to be, not just for you, but for Canada.
That's excellent, Yulia. Thank you so much for that. It's a great resource center facility, rather, that the EDC offers, and it is available through the EDC website. As Yulia mentioned, you don't have to be a member. You can just simply sign up, and away you go, and start accessing that information. And it's certainly not just applicable to Canadian companies. It doesn't really matter where you're located in the world. This information is going to help you. We're getting a little short on time, so we'll just get to one or two more questions, and then we will wrap things up for today. There is one thing that I've been thinking about over the course of this seminar. And if we're looking at a fairly small company, let's say you're 100 employees or less, or even 50 employees or less, and you can't really afford to have a chief compliance officer and a chief integrity officer and so forth. You may only really have one or two people who are essentially responsible for your compliance, for your anti-corruption, and so forth. So I'm a company, let's say, that has limited resources, but I do want to create or strengthen my anti-corruption culture or anti-corruption policies and standards. But again, I just don't have the money or the ability to go out and be having 10 different executives in charge of all these various departments. So what would be, in your opinion, I'm asking all of you out there, and maybe James could dive in on this one, what would be sort of the 2 or 3 things that I could just focus on sort of quickly and cheaply in order to get this thing moving, in terms of really developing a decent anti-corruption culture in the company?
Thank you, Norman. Firstly, when you talk about 100 people being a small company, that is really relative, because in my country, 100 people, 200 people, that's a big company. So when you talk about small, you're probably talking about 10, 20, and there are very many. And therefore, it means that the lesser the employees, the harder it is for them to have resources and even time and attention to put in place these integrity measures. But I think I go back to what Paul said right at the beginning. It's really driven by the CEO. The CEO, who is likely to be the owner of the company or the major shareholder, must, in my opinion, first of all, embrace the fight against corruption and wanting the firm to realize value from that. And I think that it is possible to outsource a small company or an individual who can help you set up these tools, much the same way as people set up ISO 9000 or other ISO management systems. They don't cost too much, but they are there and people can help establish. Secondly, being members of professional organizations which have codes of conduct. So if it's a firm like mine where you have engineers and other professionals, you're encouraging them to join their professional organizations where they will be taken through code of conduct training. They will sign off code of conduct forms, etc. And that becomes a way of starting to inculcate a culture that will embrace the system, because it is one thing putting in a system, it is another thing embracing it. So I would say that it has to start from the heart. This war must start from somebody's heart. Thank you.
Yeah, I can jump in, Norman, and a lot of these are consistent with the the 5 kind of first steps that I talked about. And the companies I've been with don't have dedicated compliance staff at all. But if you're in a small organization, as James said, it really starts with the CEO, and your CEO has got to be kind of your compliance officer in a way. So essentially, he's got to, just go around and talk to everyone and just say, listen, this is so important to us, and emphasize, what the implications are if somebody doesn't abide by the rules. Zero tolerance policy, and make that clear. And the CEO would have to, really, walk that talk by looking at things like, well, are your salespeople all incentivized on commission? Why not give them incentives to display strong compliance instead? Move them away from full commission, and say, hey, I trust my salespeople to do the right thing. I don't want to incentivize them to, make a sale at any cost, and promotions based on integrity and ethics and that sort of thing. So I think a CEO can have the greatest impact in a small company to move you towards having strong compliance program.
And I can maybe quickly add to that, and maybe start by saying that resources are scarce for companies of all sizes, the biggest global players to the smallest. And really, believe it or not, they're scarce for me too. On a daily basis, I ask for more resources. So it's a reality for all of us, I suppose. But really, for me, the key is creating accountability, and it doesn't have to be with a compliance person. In a small organization, you can look at how to assign this accountability to, let's say, a regional manager or like a contracts manager for a particular part of the world, responsible for sales there, and make sure that they have skin in the game. Make sure that it's part of their work plan. Make sure that there's maybe some sort of report that that person has to provide with an angle on compliance, anti-corruption, ethics. I've seen that from larger companies, they do that even though they have more resources in compliance and ethics, but making sure that there are accountabilities and skin in the game for people in the company is very important.
Well, thank you, Yulia, for that. And thank you also, Paul, for diving in on that one, and James as well. So I think we'll just have time for one more quick question. And I thank all the participants for sending in questions. And I apologize if we haven't been able to get to all of them.
Norman,
yes,
I was just going to make,
yes,
make a comment on that one, picking up from what James was saying, particularly you got a small company that doesn't know where to start and may lack resources. Often some of those companies have a very senior person, maybe a recently retired person, who can step in and help with establishing the integrity management function. I think it's very important that whoever is setting up the program understands the business. It is possible to bring in resources from outside, but it's really important to know the business, because if the person putting this together doesn't understand the business, then the system won't be respected by the people who are out there trying to implement it. So that's something that can work. A recently retired senior person who's respected within the company could be very helpful.
That's terrific, John. And interestingly, the next question that I was about to ask, and it came from Samima, she had actually asked part of that question, so that's been sort of asked and answered. But the second half of her question, which was, so once you have this sort of direction in place, even if it's just the CEO, or you do actually manage to have a compliance officer on board, what about the enforcement of the FCPA, and how has that been affecting Canadian businesses? Anybody care to dive in on that one? Yeah, I don't hear a lot of response out there. Yulia, have you had companies contact you about complying with FCPA?
Yes, and as you can imagine, it may be a sensitive topic in the sense that I won't be able to discuss any particular examples, but really Canadian companies, because of footprint in the US and the extraterritorial implications of US laws, anti-corruption, but also sanctions, they do pay attention to what happens in the US. They also watch closely what happens with recent enforcement actions, the size of penalty imposed, and really, like any company that does transact in the US currency, that has an affiliate in the US, listed on the stock exchange in the US, we have some of these clients as well, they really need to pay attention to what happens in the US. And really, when it comes to assessing the risk there, my advice would be to have recourse to an external counsel, because you cannot figure it out on your own, unfortunately.
Anybody else have any comments on FCPA as it impacts on Canadian businesses?
Norman, I would say, kind of echo Yulia's comments. I mean, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, the FCPA is the standard, and the enforcement actions by Canadians government is not anything near to what the Department of Justice does. So unless you're a small domestic Canadian company that has no plans of ever going beyond its borders, you really need to look to the FCPA and make sure you're complying with it. Plus, you're setting yourself up to have a standard that really is kind of the highest international standard, and therefore you're ready to kind of be able to go anywhere around the world, and it's accepted. So I think it's important for all organizations to look to the FCPA for guidance.
Fully agreed.
And
No,
Yes, Yulia?
maybe
it's
just
James.
a quick comment here on the FCPA. I know we talked about it briefly in our presentations, and I know a lot of companies around the world and governments around the world look at that example as a best practice. But really, maybe I'm using these concepts a bit too much in my presentation today, but I really like to make it simple. And yes, FCPA and the guidance from the DOJ are very good examples, but they can ultimately be summarized in 3 simple concepts. And it applies to all compliance programs, doesn't matter the size of the company. And these really simple concepts are: your program needs to be based on detection, prevention, and mitigation. So it doesn't matter how you structure it. If you are a small company of 3 people, just apply these concepts as opposed to reading through pages and pages of the CPA DOJ guidance.
And there was, I heard a voice there just before Yulia started. That was James.
Yes, I was just going to say that one thing that has been quite prevalent is international companies coming into, a continent like Africa, and it appears that how they operate here is probably not the same way they operate when they're out there in the developed world. So you'll find that there is much more tolerance towards doing things the way they are done in that particular country, in as far as corruption is concerned. And I think you have clever people who somehow will craft ways of appearing not to be involved. I know probably the FCPA does say that you or your agents, but people get a bit clever, remembering that it could be an international company and probably has maybe very few foreign staff, maybe 2, 3, 4, 5. The rest are local, and therefore there's a likelihood that the locals may be tempted to do things the way things are done there. And obviously none of the expatriates may quite get to know. I think we have seen cases where you have franchises where the local partners who are in this franchise can somehow intermingle with government, because the largest expenses in most of these countries is really government. And you will find that there are many internationally well-branded companies operating, but they do burn their fingers once in a while. So it will be interesting to know going forward with these webinars how these companies can be held to account when they are operating in the developed world, where there is less probably visibility of what they're doing. Thank you.
Well, thank you, James, for that. One of the great pleasures of being involved in a webinar like this is being able to sit back and absorb the many years of experience and insight of the experts on our panel. And one of the sad bits is that it does have to end at some point. Corruption and anti-corruption is a big topic. It's a big tent. It involves all manner of different issues and subtexts and angles. And we could probably talk on this all day, and I would dearly love to, as I'm sure some of the participants out there and our panelists would love to keep on at this as well. But we are pushing past the 2-hour mark of today's webinar. So I'm going to ask that we sort of draw a line under it here. So that brings us to the end of today's webinar. But before we bid you all farewell, I would like to thank our panelists for that very lively and informative discussion and Q&A session, and to all of our participants for your terrific questions. I'd also like to thank Charles Lee and his team for all the technical direction that they undertook today to make this event happen. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's not just a simple case of clicking on Zoom. There's an awful lot more that goes on behind the scenes to make an event like this happen. Now, some of you did write in questions wanting to know about where you can see a recording of this event or get some of the slides. Fear not, if you have on your registration form, if you have submitted your email address to us, we will email you out a link in the days ahead where you can access a recording of this particular event. That same link will also be posted on various websites to do with the Peter A. Allard Law School at the University of British Columbia, and also on the Anti-Corruption Law Program LinkedIn page. And just a reminder that today was just the first of 12 anti-corruption events that we'll be holding throughout the year. The next one is scheduled for the 26th of February, and the topic will be protecting procurement systems from abuse. And later in the year, we'll be looking at corruption in mining, corruption in sport, whistleblowing, anti-corruption technologies, and municipal corruption in Canada. So there's lots to look forward to. So on behalf of our panel today and all of our participants and organizers, I wish you all a very pleasant day and a very pleasant weekend. And thank you so much for participating. And we look forward to being with you in a month's time. All the best.